So last week on the Appwrite YouTube channel, I released this video that teaches you how to perform basic read and write operations with the Appwrite WebSDK. And I wanted to follow up with that video and actually put together a full tutorial on how to get started with the Appwrite WebSDK and show you how to implement what we learned in that video. So what we're going to do here is actually build out a project-based tutorial. We're going to set up our entire backend from scratch. We're going to connect it to our front end, and you're going to be able to code along and see this entire process from scratch while we build out a simple application. So if that sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and keep watching and we'll get started. Okay, so as always, before I start any tutorial, I like to do a little housekeeping, show you the demo project that we're about to put together, and then talk about anything else that we need to as far as discussing the tech stack and resources. So let's start with a demo here. So I did style this application. The CSS will be provided in a link in the video description in the GitHub repo. So don't worry about that. We're going to copy and paste that part in this tutorial. That's not the focus. So the first thing here is you'll see that we have the read part of our application. We're going to make a request and render out all these items in the front end. Now with that, we can also add an item. So let's just say walk the dog. So we'll throw that in. So when I hit enter, this is going to add it. Oh, I try to submit that twice with an empty form field. That's why we got that alert. So now we see the add part. If we go ahead and complete this task, we can actually just cross that off by clicking it. That's the update part. And then if we want to delete an item, we hit the X and that deletes the item. So we have read, create, update, and delete. And that's our entire application. So very minimalist. Now, as far as the source code for this, I would highly recommend you check this out. Always good to just review the code, see what's happening and what we're about to build. So in here, this is going to be linked in the video description. As I mentioned, make sure to check out the final code in the main.js file. This is what we're building. And then the style.css file. So I just prepped some code here. If you like light theme, go ahead and just comment one of these out and then uncomment the other. We're not going to have a toggler or anything like that. Then there's the rest of the styling. It's about, let's see, 94 lines of CSS code. So we're just going to copy and paste this together, and then that's how we're going to get started. Okay, so now I want to talk about the tech stack that we're about to use here. So there is no front-end framework. We're just going to use plain old JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and then Appwrite with that. So I'm trying to make sure that this focus here is on Appwrite. We're not including any extra packages or libraries that we need to work with. So with that, we are going to use NPM to set up our application. So make sure you have Node.js installed. We'll need to do that, and then we're just going to start configuring our project. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so as promised, we're going to do everything from scratch. So I'm going to set up my boilerplate project files right now. We're going to use Vite for this, so make sure you have Node.js installed. And then once we set up our front end, we'll do some cleaning. We're going to go ahead and set up our Appwrite backend and then configure this. So from my desktop, I'm just going to run npm create Vite, and this will prompt me to set up my project. We're going to call this Todo app. This will be on my desktop here. We're going to use vanilla JavaScript, no framework. And then we're just going to use JavaScript here. So if you want to use TypeScript, that's up to you. But at this point, I'm going to close this out and I want to use the VS Code terminal. So this is the text editor of choice for me. We're just going to go ahead and open up my project files here. Let's go ahead and open up Todo app. And this is what Vite has given me. So I'm just going to go ahead and run install so I can see everything. So we'll just make sure all the packages are installed. And then we can call npm run dev. Okay, so on port 5174, that's reminds that this is what Vite has given me. I'm just going to go ahead and remove some of this stuff here because I don't want any of this. So we'll just go ahead and remove all of our CSS here. I'll save that. And then I'm going to remove everything in main.js except for the CSS import. We're going to write all of our own JavaScript code. And then I also don't want javascript.svg, so I'm going to delete that. We don't need that anymore. And then I don't need counter.js. We can get rid of that. And then inside of index.html, let's just go ahead and say hello. Now, I want to make sure everything's working. So the terminal's just fine. Let's go to the project here. And here we go. So we have a blank application. That's it. We just cleaned up our code. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and start configuring the backend. So we're going to do this on appwrite.io. You can always set up a local instance of Appwrite. I'm going to use Appwrite Cloud. There's a great free tier that we can use. So this will give us a quick start and we can set up things pretty fast. So if you don't have an account, make sure you sign up. So I'm going to go ahead and click sign up. This will log me in because I already have an account. You're going to have to create an organization. I already created one called tutorials, and I have no projects in here. So this is the first part in that step. We need to create a project, and I'm going to call this, let's see, get started tutorial. We'll call it get started tut, and that's going to give me a project ID. So we'll create the project here. That's going to take a second. Okay, project was created. Now inside of here, we see our console, we see our authentication, databases, functions, and so on. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and create my first app within the project here. So right here, we're using the Web SDK. So I'll try to stay zoomed in here. So we have web, and I'm going to go ahead and give my app a name. So we're going to call this to do app, like that. Okay. So for the host name, this is for our course configuration. Essentially, where are we connecting to our app from? So later on, when you deploy your backend, or let's say you deploy your front end, you need to let Appwrite know where we're connecting from. So at this point, we're just going to do local host. But later on, let's say you have some Vercel domain, you want to go ahead and add that here. And in fact, it even prompts you for that. So this helps us configure our course. For now, just do localhost. If you're following along the way I did everything, you should be fine just doing this. Okay, so we have our application set up. We also want to install Appwrite. So let's go ahead and go to the front end here, and let's just close out this terminal here, or turn off our server, and run npm install Appwrite. So we're going to follow along. That gives us the Appwrite SDK, and we want to go ahead and import this. So let's just go ahead and copy this. So we're importing the client object inside of our JavaScript file. So this is inside of main.js. We're going to run this import, and the client object is what's going to allow us to configure our interface to the entire Web SDK. So we're going to need to use this to set things up, and then we'll just go ahead and hit next. We also want to make sure that we set up the client object, so it already prompts us for that. We'll just hit copy to clipboard. Your project ID, you're going to want to make sure to put these inside of environment variables in the future. You don't want people seeing this information. At this point, it's fine for the tutorial. I'm going to delete this after, so I'm not concerned about this. So let's just go ahead and paste this in. So we use this client import, we instantiate the client class, and then we set our endpoint. So that's the endpoint for our backend, and then we pass in the project ID. So we have that set up, and we can just go ahead and hit next from here. And there we go, we're ready to go. So from here, I want to go ahead and set up my database. So we're going through the CRUD operations. So we're just going to go ahead and set up a database and actually add some functionality, or add some tables and attributes that we can actually play with. So let's go ahead and create a database, and we're going to call this prod. So for production, if we don't add an ID, it's just going to go ahead and generate one for us. We'll hit create here. So that's our production database. Sometimes people might have a production database and a development database. So that's kind of why we separate things. So we have our first collection. Now, Appwrite does use MariaDB. So essentially, it's a relational database, but there is a NoSQL interface for it. So that's why we use terms like collections instead of tables, but it's still a relational database. So we have our first or set of collections. So we're going to want to create one. I'm going to refer to it as tables at some point because it's still a relational database, and that's kind of what I'm used to. So I'll always have to correct myself. So for the first collection, we're going to want to go ahead and make this, we'll call this tasks. So that's going to be like my tasks table or collection. And by default, we have an ID generated for us if we don't create one. So we're just going to let it go ahead and set that up for us. And then we want to start creating attributes. So we have documents here. These are going to be like rows in a relational table database. We're just going to go ahead and create some attributes though before we actually add any documents or items. So the first attribute I'm going to add is going to be the actual body of a specific task. So that's going to be a string. Let's just set the maximum to, I don't know, we'll do 100 here. We'll call the key body here. And then we should just be able to leave it like that. So we'll create it. And that gives us our first attribute. And then I'll create another one, and this is going to be a Boolean value. So you can see we have integers, floats, Booleans, email field, URLs, and even relationships. So let's go ahead and go to a Boolean value, and we're going to say completed. So it's simply going to be true or false. So the default value will be false. So when we create a new item, it's not going to be completed. So we want to make sure completed is set to false. And let's just go ahead and hit create. And now we can actually add some documents in here. So let's go ahead and actually do this. So we created the attributes. We'll go to documents. And at this point, let's just say wash car and completed. We'll just hit next. I believe it's going to default to false. Yeah, it's not completed, so that's good. Film tutorial. I always have to stop when I'm typing because if I type and talk, I misspell a lot. So we'll do that. And then let's see, we'll add one more. Let's just say build demo. Okay. So we have 3 items in our database and we want to start connecting to this, but I want to do a quick recap here. So within the Appwrite console, if I go back to my overview page, we'll go to databases. So we always have a project ID. So we have this ID right here that we can get. Then for our database, we have a database ID that should be at the top. Oh, it's right here. So our production database. So if I click on it, we can grab the prod database. And then we have the collection ID right here. So we're going to use all of these values here and then the data inside here. Now, typically before you start connecting to a database, we need to make sure that we first set some permissions. So I'm actually going to show you the permissions, then I won't set them because I want you to see the error that's going to occur. And then that way, when you see the error happen, you'll be familiar with it and then you know how to fix it. So essentially, when we try to connect to this from the front end, Appwrite's going to say, hey, you don't have any permissions. If we don't have any set, it's just going to block that request. So in permissions here, so we went to settings and then permissions. We'll just go ahead and add permissions for specific types of users. So we can say, let's say any user can perform all these requests. We can actually set permissions to certain teams or types of users. So if we hit any, and then we can say any user can create, read, update, and delete. So these are the type of permissions that we can set. So right now, this basically gives any user access to do whatever they want with the documents in this database. So for now, we're just going to leave that blank. And we just want to connect from the front end here. So let's go ahead and actually configure the front end. And we want to actually make our first request. So what I'm going to do is import databases. So this will be an interface to actually connect with our databases on the back end. So in order to set this up, we're just going to do const, and I'll just say db is equal to new databases. And we're going to pass in this client object here. Okay, so now we're connected here and I want to make my first request here. So what I'm going to do is create a function here that's simply going to make a request. I want to read some data and we'll just see this in the console before we actually start outputting it. So let's go ahead and we're just going to write a function the old traditional way. And I want to make sure it's an async function. So let's go ahead and add that in and we'll call this get data. Actually, we'll call it get tasks like that. And I'm so used to writing arrow functions, so this is throwing me off, but I'll get used to it. So we want to make a request to get all of our tasks. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to access the database configuration or this instance right here, and I'm going to call the list documents method. This is how we can go ahead and make a request to actually get the items in a specific collection, and this will return back a JSON array. Now, in order to actually make this request though, we need the database ID. So we'll set that up, and then we need the collection underscore ID, and we want the tasks specifically. So let's go ahead and get these values. So we have the collection ID. We'll bring this in right here, and then we'll go back to the production database, and we'll bring that in right there. So we'll save that, and then the minimal requirements for list documents is the database ID and collection ID. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and fix the indentation here just to make that easier to read. At least it's easier for me. And get tasks makes a request here. So let's go ahead and do const response, and we'll just await the response, and let's see what we get back. So I want to console this out. Console.log, and we're just going to console out this response, and we need to call get tasks. Okay, so let's go ahead and just see what happens. So if I refresh this, I need to run my server again. So we'll just do npm run dev. Let's go ahead and check this out. Inspect element console, and look at that, we have an error. So this is what I wanted to show you. So it says the current user is not authorized to perform this type of request. So if we go back into our collection, this is why I wanted you to see this, because I'll go through this and then people will run into that issue and not be aware of it. We go to settings here, and in permissions, right now we are technically any user. We're not logged in. We really don't have a status right now. So we're just going to go ahead and say anybody can read, create, update, and delete. Now, in a real application, you might want to be careful with this and be more specific on who you're allowing. But for this demo, because we're running it locally, we just want to see what occurs here. So we're just going to go ahead and hit update, make sure that saves. And then when we go to the front end, I should be able to make this request. There we go. So we get back this response. So when get tasks was run, we get back the total. So we have 3 documents. And we have the objects inside of an array. So we have the first one, wash car, completed as false. And then you'll notice by default, there are certain attributes created for us. So we have updated at, permissions, which is how we can set more like role level permissions, the ID of the document, database ID, created at, and collection ID. So that's our first request here. So what I'm going to do here is I actually want to render these out. We're going to go ahead and add some styling, and I want to render them out in the front end. Make sure that looks good, and then we'll actually start continuing on with the rest of the functionality, and that will be to actually perform create operations from the front end. So let's jump to our GitHub repo where we actually have all the styling and the HTML code that we need, and we're just gonna copy and paste some of these things in here. So everything from the container ID to the closing div, we have a form and simply an empty div with an ID of task list. We're just gonna go ahead and copy this because this is where we're actually gonna append our elements to. So let's go ahead and remove what we have here. So everything inside of body, let's make sure to add that in. So again, if you want to write that from scratch, we have a div, ID container, form, ID form, input, and task lists. And then back inside of our GitHub repo, let's see, so we have that form now. Let's go to the style.css. Okay, so from here, we're just going to go ahead and grab all of this, copy that, and let's bring this into our style.css. And there we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our JavaScript file. And here we can start writing things out here. So we get the tasks here, then we console out the response. And what I want to do here is actually go ahead and create the DOM element and then render it to the DOM. So we have that response. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and create a new function. So we'll create a function. By default, I always just like to make them an async function because usually we perform some kind of operation there or some kind of operation where we need to wait. So we'll just go ahead and create this function and we'll call this render to DOM. And there we go. So we have this function. Before we build anything out here, let's go ahead and call this task here. So we're going to pass in the actual tasks. So I'm going to go ahead and call this function here inside of get tasks. So we make the request here, and then what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and create a for loop, and we're going to do this the old school way where I just do let I is equal to 0. Then we're just going to go ahead and do response.documents. So remember in the console, we have the total, and then we have the array, so documents, and then we have objects inside of that. So that's why we're going to response.documents and then .length. So if that's greater than I, let's go ahead and just increment I. So we'll do I++. And let's complete that loop. We're just going to go ahead and call render to DOM. And inside of this method, we're going to pass in each object or each document here. So let's go ahead and do response.documents. And then we'll just get the current iteration. And at this point, I just want to go ahead and console this out. So I know that this isn't the ideal way. This is where front-end frameworks do really well, where you don't have to build out your own DOM elements. Usually they have this automatic refreshing when you update state, but because we decided to go with just JavaScript, we're going to have to do it this way. So render to DOM, we console out each task. Okay, so here we go. So we have that initial response, and then we get back the object 3 times. Now with this object, we're going to go ahead and access the ID value and then the actual body value along with completed, and we want to make sure that that is being output here and visible. So with that, let's go ahead and go to render to DOM here. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and just remove this console here, and we're going to go ahead and create the actual DOM element, and I'm going to create it as a string using template literals or backticks. We're going to insert the items there, and then we're going to use insert adjacent HTML, that method, to actually append it to the DOM. If you're not familiar with it, we're going to do this in a second. So let's go ahead and create this. So we'll just call this task wrapper, and we'll use 2 backticks. We'll create a div here. Let's go ahead and close off the div. And we'll try to add in the necessary classes as we go, and I'll try to make sure to explain everything. Okay, so we just have a string here. And in here, let's go ahead and add in the actual element or the actual text. So we'll create a paragraph tag, close that off. And we're going to go ahead and add in the task body. We'll throw that in, and then we want to go ahead and throw in that X here for the delete button. And that's going to be just a string X. I didn't want to import any icon library. We're just going to do X like that. That's not the focus. So here we have our item. We'll do a little bit more styling in a second. But once we have that, we're just going to go ahead and actually grab this, let's see, this HTML element. We're going to grab this ID right here. So we want to query tasks list. So we want to get that. I'll set that in a variable at the top here, just under DB. Task list, and then we'll do document.get element by ID. We'll grab that, and then we're going to get this list right here, this HTML element, and we're just going to go ahead and call insert adjacent HTML, and we'll just see how this works. So insert adjacent HTML, and where we want to insert each item on each iteration is going to be after begin. So this is going to be inside of the div, but at the top. So every item is going to be put at the top, so pushing down every other item. And then we're going to take our task wrapper, and that'll be the second parameter, and that should go ahead and take this and append it to the DOM. So let's go ahead and just see what we have. And there we go. So the styling isn't the best. We'll make sure to fix that by simply adding in some classes. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside of our style.css, I have some styles for the task wrapper. So we're going to add a class here, the delete button. So it has that red, the hover effect, and then this class right here for complete true. So whenever we have this class, we're going to make sure that we have a dash through that specific text. And I'll show you how we're going to actually implement that. So for this div, first we want to make sure we have a task wrapper. So that's the first one. Then we want to make sure we can identify every single task here, because when we hit delete, we need to know what item to actually delete or update. We're going to add in an ID, and this is going to be task dash, and then we're going to go ahead and throw in the actual task ID. So it's task dot $ID. So that's the default way that Appwrite is actually storing the ID value, or that's the key name right there. So that way we have a unique ID. If we want to take a look at this, so look at that, we already have some styling there. Now when we render this out, we see task and then the ID value, and then we can see that for the next value. So we have custom IDs. Now we can actually identify each value. Now for this value here, let's go ahead and go to the body, and we'll just do class is equal to complete. And then for the true or false value, we need to know how to style it. So we're just going to do task.completed. So completed like that. Okay. So essentially, this is going to be a string value of true or false. And remember, when we have complete is equal to true, we get that line through it, and that's where the styling comes from. So I'll try to zoom in a little bit more. Actually, I think I'm going to have to zoom out just because I can't really see that. Okay, so we have that there, and let's go ahead and just test it. But before we do that, let's go ahead and add in, let's see, delete. And then I also want to add in an item, because when we click a delete, when we click on delete itself, we want to make sure we know what item we're deleting. So we'll just do delete. And then just like we did for the ID here, we'll just take in the task ID. So task.id. Okay, and that should be it. So let's try that. So we see the red styling. That looks good. Awesome. And then let's go ahead and just make sure an item is complete. So we'll go to tasks here, and let's just say film to, actually, let's say build demo. So right now it's false, and I want to go ahead and just go to data. We'll just update it from here. We'll set that to true. So now if I refresh it, there we go, we have that styling implemented. So we haven't added any of that click functionality in, but that's ready to go. And we officially rendered the items to the DOM. So we completed the get tasks method. So what I want to do now is go ahead and add some event listeners to this form. When we submit this form, I want to actually have a function that takes that information and sends it to the backend and actually creates an item. So let's go ahead and start with that. So for this, we're going to create a new function. But before we do that, we want to make sure we get the form. So let's just go ahead and do const. Let's see, this will be our form. This is document.getElement by ID. I have the ID of form, so we'll go ahead and query that. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and create the function here. So we'll make that an async function. Okay. We have that, and we'll pass in the event here. And this is going to be add task. And then before we do anything else, let's go ahead and call e.prevent default. So we don't want this form to submit. So we'll do e.prevent default. So we want to take care of what actually happens when we submit the form. And then for the form here, we're just going to go ahead and add the event listener. So we'll do form.add event listener on submit. We're going to go ahead and call add task. There we go. And now we can go for the actual functionality that occurs when we submit this. Okay, so the first thing is I want to make sure that there isn't an empty value in the actual form field. So we're first going to check the body of that form field, and we're just going to do const body. Just call this let's call this task body. So the actual value. So we have the task body, and this is going to be e.target. And then we're going to get the actual body and then the value. And we have that because we named it body right there. Okay, so we have the task body, and we're just going to check if task body is equal to a string. Then we're just going to go ahead and create an alert. We'll just say alert. And we'll do form cannot be empty. Just a little housekeeping. So we'll yell at everyone for that, and then we'll just return nothing. So we basically want to end this function. Okay, so let's check this out. So if I try to submit it with nothing, there we go. We get that alert. Awesome. Okay, so now for the Appwrite part. Now for this, we have the actual, let's see, for the, just like we called list documents, we have the method to create a document. So we're going to call the DB class, and we're going to call create document. And for this, just like list documents required, we're going to require the database ID and collection ID. So we want to know what database are we updating, what collection are we adding this specific item to. So we first need to specify that. And then once we do that, we need to also pass along an ID for the new value. So that's going to be the next parameter here, but we can generate this in any way we want. But Appwrite does actually give us a helper method that generates an Appwrite formatted ID. So just the way that Appwrite does it, we can just go ahead and use that. I don't want to have to create my own ID. I don't want to have to verify if this ID exists. Any verification stuff. Appwrite makes this easier by simply giving us this ID class. So we import that along with databases and client. Then with this, we can call the ID class here and then call unique like that. And that's going to generate a unique ID when we call it. And that ID is going to look a lot like every other ID here. So it's going to look something like this, and it's going to make sure that it's unique. So with that, we generate a new ID for that specific document, and then we just pass along the payload. Now, the attributes I'm going to pass along is going to be body, and we're just going to go ahead and pass task body in here. So whatever was in that form field, we're not going to worry about passing completed. We could also do completed and then pass in true. At this point, we're just going to go ahead and set that. We already have a default value for completed. So that's it right there. We call create document, and this will go ahead and add it. So what I'm going to do is actually grab this render to DOM method, and we're going to get a response here. So the response will be the newly created document. So we want to go ahead and get that response, and then we're going to call render to DOM, and that's going to give us the response there for adding this item to the DOM right here. And then I just want to refresh my form. So we'll do form.reset like that. And there we go. So let's recap this. We have at task. When the form is submitted, we go ahead and get the body field. We get the value of that. We make sure that the form actually has some content in it. And then we call create document, pass along the database ID, collection ID, the ID of the document, and the body, and then render to the DOM and reset that form. Okay, and the event listener or handler was right here. Okay, so let's try that. So let's go ahead and refresh, and let's just do test. We'll hit enter, and there we go. And then we can just do 1, 2, 3, and now we have some items here. So if I go to my Appwrite database, let's go ahead and check the collection. Let's refresh it. And there we go. Awesome. So we've successfully listed out items. We've added items to the DOM. And the next thing I want to do is actually go ahead and show you how to remove items. So right here, 1, 2, 3 looks pretty ugly. We want to go ahead and just remove them. Let's say that was an accidental add. Let's go ahead and start adding in the functionality to remove these. Okay, so let's jump back into our code. And for the delete functionality, we're just going to go ahead and add this inside of our render to DOM method. So again, because we're not using our front-end framework, we're going to have to do this in a little bit of a hacky way. I really don't like writing code this way, but it's going to accomplish what we need here. So as we render an item to the DOM, we go ahead and create it and we append it. And at this point, on each iteration, we're actually going to add the event listener for the delete button. Like when we click this button right here, when we click it, we need to add an event listener. It has to catch that event. It has to know what document we clicked on. So that's why we passed in an ID to it. And then we simply remove that document. And we remove that document by knowing the ID of the document here in this value for the wrapper. So let's go ahead and build that in right here. So first thing is I want to go ahead and get the delete button, and we'll do document.getElement by ID. And at this point on each iteration, because we still have access to the task, we'll just go ahead and use backticks here. We'll just do delete, and then we'll pass in the task.id. So we're literally grabbing this value right here. So we're querying this. So we just got it. And then we want to go ahead and handle the delete functionality. So we'll just do delete button.add event listener. So on the iteration, we're already adding the event listener to it. We're just going to do on click. So when we click it, we're just going to go ahead and delete the button. Let's just add this in line. So we're not going to create a new function for it. We'll just go ahead and build this in right here. And at this point, I'll use an arrow function, and let's just do db.delete document. So we have list document, create document, and now we have delete document. And the same format goes for all of these. We simply need the database ID and the task ID. That's always the start for each one of these methods. So we'll go ahead and add that in. And then to delete a document, all we need is the document ID. So we'll just simply pass that in. So we'll just do task.id. So this will remove the actual task here. So we'll go ahead and call this, but I want to make sure it gets deleted right away. So actually, I guess it really doesn't matter. We'll just call it right after. I shouldn't want there to be a delay, but we can just call it here. It shouldn't be bad at all. So let's just go ahead and delete the document from the database. And then we're just going to go ahead and call document.getElement by ID. We're going to grab this wrapper right here. So we can actually just copy this code, use backticks, paste that in. So we get the document wrapper that we just clicked on delete, and then we're just going to do .remove. And that's going to remove the HTML from our front end here. So let's go ahead and delete 3. And let's make sure it actually deleted it. So we'll go back here, refresh it, and 3 is gone. Awesome. And then we can delete 2, 1, test. Let's refresh it, and that's delete. Now for update, this is also going to be pretty simple. It's going to be, again, feels hacky to me, I guess I'm just so used to front end frameworks that this feels hacky, and in many ways this is actually probably just fine, but just not used to writing it this way. But let's see, we have delete, we got those elements. Now to update it, what I'm going to do here is actually, let's see, how do I want to do this? I think what I'm going to do here is go ahead and grab this wrapper. I'm going to put this into a variable. So let's go ahead and do const wrapper, and then we'll call document.getElement by ID. Let's grab this entire wrapper. And at this point, I just realized we can actually just go ahead and call that right here. So we can just call wrapper.remove for this specific task here. So we'll get that. And then what I want to do is make sure that when we select the paragraph tag, so for this, just under the delete event listener, we're going to call wrapper. And then at this point, we can do .child nodes, and we're going to get the first node. So if we look at the HTML here, this is the first node right here. So we're going to get the paragraph tag, and then we're going to add an event listener. It's actually the second node at this point. So just the way that child nodes works, this will be 1, so index 1, which will make it the second. And then we're just going to go ahead and do add event listener. On click, let's go ahead and continue this. So we'll go ahead and make this an async function. We'll take the event, close it out. Okay, so in here, the first thing I'm going to do is store just a local instance of task here. So we're going to do task.completed. And this is going to be equal to the opposite of task completed. So if task completed was true, then we're going to call it task completed. Forgot what this was called. It was that's not the not operator in this case. It's like, I don't remember the details of it, but yeah, essentially this will give us the opposite value of here. So if this is true, this will be false. So we simply invert it, whatever that value is. And then we're just going to go ahead and let's see, we're going to change the class name of this right here. So completed right now is true, let's say. So when we update it, we're going to go ahead and update it with a new value. So to true or false. So we can just do e.target. So the paragraph tag that we clicked on, class name, and that's going to be equal to complete, and then the new value of task.completed. And that's it. So we simply grab the paragraph tag, update task completed locally or within the DOM here, because we don't want to have to go and get that item again from the backend. We can simply pull that in here as it keeps its local state. So we want to update that, but it's not going to update it officially in the backend yet. So if I click on this, we can see this occurring, but when I refresh it, it's still not complete. So we want to finish up the last part of this, which is calling db.update document, and we'll pass in the DB ID, the collection ID, and this one's a lot like create. So we have the create document method, except for the ID, we're going to take in the current ID of this specific task. And then for the payload, we're just going to go ahead and pass in completed, because we're not going to update the body, completed, and this is going to be equal to task completed. So whatever the new value is. So we'll actually update it based on what we updated here. And let's see. Let's hit film tutorial, refresh it. There we go. It updated. So right now it's false. So if we refresh film tutorial, it's true. And there we go. So that's it for the create, read, update, and delete functionality. It looks like every feature is working. We're able to remove stuff, update stuff, and add new items. Okay, so that does it for this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned a bunch. Make sure to leave me feedback in the comment section on things I can do better, maybe a recommendation for the next tutorial, and make sure to subscribe to the Appwrite YouTube channel, and I'll see you all in the next video.